The county records called it Parcel 18-47. The locals had a different name. They called it the Green Graveyard. For nearly a decade, 143 acres sat at the end of a gravel road that nobody drove unless they had to. From the road, you couldn't see much. Just a wall of kudzu, 20 feet tall in places, climbing over rusted fence posts, collapsing barns, and trees that had disappeared beneath curtains of living green. In summer, the vines looked almost beautiful. Up close, they smothered everything they touched. The county tried selling it 6 times. The highest bid never reached half the asking price. Surveyors refused to walk it without machetes. Timber companies said the harvest wasn't worth the cleanup. Farmers looked at the hillsides, shook their heads, and drove away. Eventually, the county stopped advertising it. It simply sat, waiting. Nobody expected the next buyer to arrive pulling a livestock trailer. Nobody expected what she would find buried on that ridge. And nobody, not even Margaret Hale, expected that what she uncovered had been waiting there for nearly 100 years for exactly this moment. Margaret Hale was 42 years old. She had spent 20 years restoring damaged land across the southeast, wetlands destroyed by hurricanes, riverbanks collapsed by floods, hillsides poisoned by abandoned mines. She had seen landscapes most people believed were beyond saving. She knew better. But this purchase wasn't another restoration project. It was personal. Her father had spent his whole life talking about buying a piece of land. Every Sunday after church, he would slow the truck whenever they passed a neglected farm. He would go quiet for a moment. Then, that place had good bones once. Or, somebody loved that land. You can still see it if you know where to look. He liked to say that land remembers what people forget. He never managed to buy any. Bills arrived. Life happened. Dreams became conversations instead of decisions. After he passed, Margaret found a notebook in an old toolbox. Worn cover, dense handwriting, dozens of pages. Every page contained sketches of abandoned farms, hand-drawn outlines of barns, orchards, field layouts. Notes about restoring forests, ideas about bringing neglected ground back to life. And on page after page, in his handwriting, the same sentence appearing and reappearing like he was trying to get it right. If nobody saves forgotten places, they disappear twice. Once from the landscape, and once from memory. She read that sentence sitting on his porch with the toolbox open in her lap. She read it several times. Then she closed the notebook and started making phone calls. Within a year, she had resigned from her engineering position, liquidated a significant portion of her savings, and purchased the property the county had given up on. Her friends called it reckless. Her coworkers called it a midlife crisis. Her accountant called it financial suicide. The county clerk called it something else. He looked at the paperwork twice before sliding it across the desk. "You know what you're buying?" Margaret looked at him. "I know what everyone else thinks they're selling." 3 weeks after closing, 74 Kiko goats stepped onto the property. Kiko goats were bred for exactly this: foraging in difficult terrain, eating what other animals won't, thriving in conditions that discourage everything else. Neighbors gathered at the roadside. One older white male farmer, arms crossed, said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "She'll run out of money before those goats run out of weeds." Laughter followed. Margaret opened the trailer gates. The goats didn't hesitate. They poured onto the hillside with the business-like confidence of animals that know their purpose, immediately disappearing beneath the curtain of vines. Within hours, faint pathways appeared through vegetation that hadn't been touched in years. By the end of the first week, patches of daylight reached the forest floor for the first time in nearly a decade. The transformation was slow, painfully slow. Every cleared acre seemed to reveal 2 more buried beneath another layer of growth. Collapsed fences emerged, old wagon ruts resurfaced, stone walls appeared where no one remembered them being. Even the remains of a long-forgotten spring house rose from beneath the tangled root systems, like something trying to remember what it was. Margaret documented everything. Every stone, every rusted tool, every weathered fence post. She wasn't clearing a farm, she was reading one. Then something started happening that she couldn't explain. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss. Whenever she rotated the goats to a new section, they spread out naturally, eager, efficient, methodical. Except for one place, a steep ridge near the northern boundary. Every time the herd drifted toward it, the same thing happened. They approached, paused, then quietly turned away. Not one goat stayed there for long. Margaret assumed predators had passed through. She searched for tracks. Nothing. She checked for poisonous plants. Nothing unusual. She walked the slope herself. The ground looked ordinary. The vegetation matched every other hillside. Still, the goats refused. Days became weeks. The rest of the property slowly opened up beneath 74 sets of hungry teeth. But that single ridge remained wrapped in its thick green vines, untouched, waiting. She would think about it later, much later, and realize that the goats had known before she did. Animals often do. They sense things through instinct that science takes years to prove: unstable ground, underground water movement, subtle changes in soil chemistry. What kept them away from that ridge wasn't fear. It was preference. The plants there weren't what they wanted. Which meant, though Margaret didn't understand this yet, the plants there were different from everything else. She was standing at the edge of the slope on a cool October evening, goats gathered behind her in the fading light, when she saw it. The sun was going down. The shadows went long across the hillside, and in that specific quality of late light, the kind that reveals rather than conceals, something appeared beneath the vine cover. Not a rock, not a stump, a straight line, too straight to be natural. Nature bends, nature twists, nature sprawls and approximates. It does not make straight lines in untouched hillsides. She stepped closer. Another line appeared, parallel to the first, almost perfectly spaced. She crouched and brushed away a handful of vines with her work boot. Stone. Cut by human hands, half buried beneath decades of soil and roots, but unmistakably, deliberately shaped. She stood up slowly, looked along the ridge, looked at the vines covering everything above and below. Thought about the goats, thought about her father's notebook. If nobody saves forgotten places, they disappear twice. She went home. She didn't sleep much that night. At sunrise, she returned with a shovel, a brush, a notebook, and the oldest plat map she could find in the courthouse archives. The map showed property boundaries, an old wagon road, and the location of a spring. Nothing more. No buildings, no terraces, no walls. Whatever had once existed on that ridge had either never been recorded or someone had stopped talking about it long before anyone thought to write it down. She knelt and began pulling vines by hand. The wall stretched farther than she'd expected. 10 feet, then 20, then 40. By lunchtime, nearly 60 feet of dry stacked fieldstone, each rock fitted tightly against the next without mortar, the craftsmanship too precise to have been built for decoration. This was structural. It had a purpose. She just didn't know what. Then she noticed the trees. She had been moving through them all morning without looking at them properly. Now she stopped. Most abandoned woodlands were chaotic. Maples and sweet gum and pine competing in every direction. Saplings filling every gap. Nothing in order. These trees weren't like that. They stood with unusual spacing. Almost intentional spacing. She pulled a measuring tape from her pack. First trunk to second, 29 feet. Second to third, 31. Third to fourth, 28. Her hands stilled on the tape. Rows. Not perfect, but close enough that coincidence couldn't explain it. Someone had planted this hillside. Decades ago. Someone had planted it, and then, somehow, the knowledge of what it was had disappeared entirely. Late that afternoon, she found the last piece. Half buried beneath roots. The remains of an iron pipe. Not plumbing. Irrigation. The metal had rusted almost beyond recognition, but the joints still followed a deliberate curve across the slope. Agricultural irrigation. On a hillside. In what everyone had always assumed was timber. She sat back on her heels and looked up through the canopy. Farmers didn't install irrigation systems in timber stands. Whatever grew on this ridge had been valuable enough to justify the extraordinary effort of hauling water uphill. The question wasn't whether people had farmed here. The question was, what? That evening, she drove into town for supplies. The cashier at the hardware store noticed the dirt on her boots. "You working that old county place?" She nodded. "Found stone terraces, up on the north ridge." The man's expression changed. The smile went away. "Up north?" "That's right." He hesitated. Set down what he was holding. "My grandfather always told us not to wander up there." "Why?" "He never said." Margaret waited. "Did he ever mention what used to be there?" The man leaned against the counter, thinking. Then, "He called it the old mountain grove." She felt something shift in her chest. "Grove of what?" "I don't remember." A pause. "My granddad quit talking about it after my great-grandfather died. It wasn't much, but it was the first time anyone had given that ridge a name. The old mountain grove." She drove home saying it quietly to herself. Groves weren't random. Groves were planted, managed, harvested, named. Someone had given this place a name. Someone had tended it. Someone had known exactly what those trees were and exactly what the irrigation was for. And then, somewhere between generations, the knowledge had simply stopped, disappeared. Twice. She climbed the ridge one last time before dark. Standing near the highest terrace, she looked downhill. From this angle, for the first time, the spacing between the trees resolved into something clear. They formed gentle arcs, following the contour of the mountain, tier by tier down the slope. Not wilderness, a design. She reached out and pressed her palm against the bark of the nearest large trunk. It was deeply ridged, broken into long gray-brown plates, different from the oaks, different from the hickories she'd catalogued below. She frowned. Something about it nagged at her. The texture, the form, the particular quality of the wood. She had seen this before. She was almost certain she had seen this before. She took photographs from 4 different angles and emailed them that night to a colleague at the university, a forest ecologist who specialized in Appalachian species, someone she trusted precisely because he never overreacted. Her message was 6 words. "Can you identify this?" "Something's off." She didn't expect a reply until morning. Her phone buzzed 19 minutes later. 6 words back. "Don't cut another tree. Call me." She read it twice, then a third time. This colleague was not someone who exaggerated. He was not someone who responded to field photographs in 19 minutes. He was not someone who used language like that unless he had very specific reasons. She looked at the phone. She looked at the ridge. The evening light was gone now. The hillside was dark. Somewhere below, one of the goats let out a low sound before the property fell silent. Margaret Hale looked at that dark hillside and understood something she couldn't yet name. Whatever was up there, whatever those trees were, whatever that irrigation had fed, whatever the old mountain grove had once produced, it wasn't gone. It had simply been waiting. The same way forgotten places wait, patiently, in the dark, for someone finally willing to ask the right question. She called him back standing on the ridge, in the dark, with a flashlight. He talked for 22 minutes. She said almost nothing. What he described, the species he believed he was looking at, the historical record of its cultivation in this region, what its presence on a managed terraced hillside with intentional irrigation would mean, was not what she had expected to hear. Not even close. After she hung up, she stood for a long time in the dark on the ridge that the goats had refused. She thought about her father, about his notebook, about the sketches of abandoned farms, about the sentence he had written over and over as if trying to fix it permanently to the page. If nobody saves forgotten places, they disappear twice. She had come here to do what he never could. She had thought that meant clearing the vines, fixing the fences, restoring the fields. She hadn't understood yet that sometimes a forgotten place doesn't need to be restored. It needs to be found. The ridge waited around her, patient as it had always been, holding what it had held for 100 years. And for the first time since buying the green graveyard, Margaret Hale stood on her land and felt the specific weight of a story that had been waiting for her before she knew to look for it. Her father had been right. Land remembers. People forget. But sometimes, if someone arrives with a shovel and enough patience and 74 goats, the land remembers loud enough to be heard. The Farmer's Ledger. More stories from the land.
Subscribe for more.